The Bible is marching on. No man can keep Bible prophecy from actually occurring. In Deuteronomy 28, in verse 1, it says that if the nation, Israel at that time, but this applies to any nation on the face of the earth, and if it would only obey the Lord our God, His commandments, keep His statutes and His judgments, that nation would be blessed above all nations on the face of the earth. However, in verse 15, it makes quite a startling statement. It says, "But it shall come to pass, if you will not hearken unto the voice of the Lord your God, to observe to do all His commandments and His statutes which I command you this day, that all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." The rest of the chapter shows what will happen when any nation disobeys the living God of the universe. The principle of cause and effect goes into operation, and it's according to the nation itself and the individuals that make up that nation as to whether it will be a blessed nation or whether the curses will pass upon it. If curses pass upon that nation because of disobedience, then what are some of the effects? When you read Deuteronomy 28, starting in verse 16 through the rest of the chapter, it shows undeniably that the nation would fall apart. There would be internal infiltration. There would be external vices that would be placed upon the nation, and that nation would eventually crumble and fall. I'll begin to unravel some of these things that are happening to the United States of America today because of those curses that have been placed upon this country. Back when this country was first founded, it had a judiciary system that was based upon English common law. There were 12 jurors under this original system, and the original documents that are placed in the archives of the United States. And anytime anyone went in for trial, they had a trial by jury. There were 12 individuals of their peers who would sit in judgment. First of all, they would judge the law to see if they had violated, or if that law was a right and just law, whether the person should have been brought before the court and the judges in the first place. If the law was not constitutional, and if it was not according to the common law based upon biblical principle, then the law was struck down as null and void. And the case was dismissed, and the individual went his way, a free man or a free woman. This is not the case today. When you go into the jury room, the judge instructs you, or the jurors, that they are only to judge the individual as to whether he or she violated that law. Meaning, no matter what law has been passed, whether the people who passed it were evil individuals, they had intent to subvert and overthrow the government, and they had wormed their way into places to pass laws. If those laws were against the Constitution or the common law of the Bible, then they were only to judge the individual whether they broke that law or not, and not to judge the law. That's why law after law in America that at one time would have been placed aside, and people would not be in prisons today, that's why they're there. Because you only judge their evil laws that they are fostering upon the people. But God said if we violated His way of life, and if we turned away from His living commandments and His statutes and judgments, then this would be one of the effects. There would be no such thing as righteous judgment in the land anymore. From the Soldier's Training Manual, issued by the War Department on November 30th, 1928. Notice the definition of two different forms of government. One of them was democracy. Here is the definition given by the War Department of the United States government. Democracy, a government of the masses. In other words, you can vote, 51% can vote a new law into existence that would discriminate against the other 49%. I'll continue the quote. Authority derived through mass meeting of any form of direct expression. Results of this form of government, mob democracy. There is no fairness in this form of government to the people. Notice what they said in this War Department document the attitude would be of those nations that ruled in a democracy. Attitude toward property becomes communistic, negating property rights. Have we seen this in the United States of America today? Have we seen a communistic system being placed upon those who have private rights, property rights? You own your home, and all of a sudden they pass taxes by a simple majority, and then if those individuals cannot pay that heavy taxation, or is your house sold out from under you and your right of ownership of private property taken away? This is called a communistic attitude. It goes on to say in this war document, the attitude toward law is that the will of the majority shall regulate, whether it be based upon deliberation or governed by passion. And when people are inflamed and impassioned, they rule according to their emotions and not according to absolute standards of right and wrong, which God's law is. It says they will rule according to prejudice and impulse, without restraint or regard to the consequences in the long run. The result is demagogism, a license to disobey law, agitation, discontent, and eventual anarchy. When a nation goes into anarchy, it is overthrown eventually every time and a dictator is set up. Now do you understand why they have replaced the constitutional republic with the terminology democracy? And that's all you hear on the national media when they talk about the form of government we have in this country. Democracy, democracy. That is mobocracy, and it has nothing to do with the Constitution of the United States whatsoever. Notice now what they say in this War Department publication about a Republican form of government. Authority is derived through the election by the people of public officials who are best fitted to represent them. The attitude toward property is respect for laws and individual rights, and a sensible economic procedure. I grew up as a teenager in the 50s. People had respect for other people's rights, their property, their fruit trees. They had respect. They called each other Mr. Smith, Mrs. Smith, Mr. Jones, Mrs. Jones. A teenager or even a child never would call someone by their first name if they were an adult. It was always Mr. and Mrs. or Miss So-and-so if they ever called them by their first name. That was the attitude, because at that time we were still basically under the Republican form of government, and they had not completed their transition to a democracy, which causes chaos and a breakdown of respect in every form. They said in this War Department publication, the attitude toward law is the administration of justice in accordance with fixed principles. Now stop and think what God said in Deuteronomy chapter 28 verse 15. If you will not keep my commandments, which are fixed principles for every single person walking planet Earth to obey, everyone must go by the law. You shall not kill, which means premeditated murder. You shall not steal. You should not commit adultery. You shall not covet. Every person on planet Earth, if they obeyed those laws, it would be fixed principles by which they lived. And it said that these fixed principles would be established by evidence, and there would be a strict regard to the consequences of the individual's actions if they broke those laws. A greater number of citizens and extent of territory may be brought within its compass or its boundaries, because there is one law for everyone, and it doesn't differ. And you can't vote 51% to 49% to change a law that discriminates against anyone. Every law is absolute for everyone. Notice what it says in this War Department. Thus, a Republican form of government avoids the dangerous extreme of either tyranny or mobocracy. And it results in statesmanship, liberty, reason, justice, contentment of the population, and progress. End of quote. This is why they have now taken the Republican form of government away from the people in the United States of America, because they know eventually there will be discontent and there will be a collapse of the United States government, and it will go into a dictatorship and tyranny, preparing for the New World Order or the world government. Now, is this 1 David J. Smith 4 verse 3 that I'm going to be talking about today? I'm going to give you absolute documentation from the writings of their own hands and coming right out of the minds of those that are working feverishly to destroy this country. In a publication called World Citizenship, a global ethic for sustainable development, they're talking about everyone on earth, every government needs to be teaching and training, I call it brainwashing, their young people to become world citizens or global citizens. Here's what it says, just one phrase out of page 1 of this World Citizenship book put out by the United Nations organization. The greatest challenge facing the world community is to release the enormous financial, technical, human, and moral resources required for sustainable development. What is sustainable development? When you read all the literature put out by these people, it's nothing more than fancy words for the redistribution of the wealth of the world, just like the Marxists said in the Communist Manifesto, that they have to take from the rich and give to the poor to make everybody in the world equal. That's why they passed NAFTA. Not so that it would increase or build up Mexico, but so that it would redistribute the wealth from the United States to Mexico, lower our level of standing, and raise theirs in Mexico until we finally became equally poor. That's what their purpose was. On page 2 of this World Citizenship book, it says, fostering world citizenship is a practical strategy for promoting sustainable development. If everybody in the world becomes sentimental about you're living in a global society, then you're going to be willing to give up some of your food to send it somewhere else. Instead of you having a steak once or twice a week, you'll be willing never to have a steak. It can be redistributed. You can have hamburger meat and they can have hamburger meat. And that way nobody lives good, but everybody equally poor all over the world except those who are in charge. It goes on and says, so long as disunity, that means the lack of global government, as long as there are individual nation states, antagonisms, provincialisms, characterize the social, political, and economic relations within and among nations, a global, sustainable pattern of economic development cannot be established. Then they went on to show that starting back in the 19th century, 100 years ago, they began to promote the entire program behind the scenes in foreign nations outside the United States first to talk about global world citizenship. Then they said the concept of world citizenship is not new to the world community. It is both implicit and explicit in a host of United Nations documents, charts, and agreements with nations, including the very opening words of the United Nations Charter, we the peoples of the United Nations. It is already being promoted around the world across all cultural boundaries. End of quote. In this same publication, on page 3, it says, the following proposal for a campaign to promote world citizenship fits naturally into the framework for reorienting education, public awareness, and training towards sustainable development. In other words, they said they have to re-educate the world and to make people aware that they're developing world citizenship, and no longer are you to have a loyalty to your individual nation state. That's why it becomes increasingly difficult when you go to ball games where they used to stand up and have the national anthem. You put your hand on your heart and you sang along. Now fewer and fewer people do it. It's an embarrassment because of the public pressure that's being placed for world governance. Here's what they said, and I quote one more time from page 3. The United Nations, governments, and educational agencies should seek to make the principle of world citizenship part of the standard education of every child. End of quote. That means anyone that goes to a public school in the United States of America today will be brainwashed to become a world citizen. Notice on page 5 of this publication, World Citizenship, quote, campaigns to raise public awareness of the challenges of world citizenship must make use of the full range of media and the arts. What is media? Radio, television, everything that has to do with listening and hearing. So they're going to use the mass media where everybody comes in and parks themselves immediately after they come in from work and sits down, turns on the tube, and begins to watch. And little by little, everything is world citizenship. World this, world that. It's not the United States anymore. Watch closely and you'll see how subtly they use these subliminal advertisements in order to brainwash our mind into a world community. On page 6, they make this quote, world citizenship must become the single most important point of ethical reference in all United Nations activities. This means this is the most important thing for them to begin to produce into the minds of individuals. You are a part of the world and not just the United States of America. As a direct result, they said on this same page, they would encourage the advertising industry to begin to promote world citizenship. Now I want to read to you a letter the very first city and mayor in the United States of America that declared the citizens of his city a world citizen. A joint resolution of the Hennepin County Board of Commissioners, Mayor and City Council of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Whereas in recognition of the greatly increased interdependence of the world in this nuclear age, and whereas realizing that the common interest of man can only be met through world cooperation, and whereas seeking to free mankind from the curse of war and to harness all available sources of energy and knowledge to the service of men's needs, and whereas aware that we can best serve our city, county, state, and nation when we also think and act as world citizens. Now therefore be it resolved that we, the Mayor, City Council of Minneapolis, and Hennepin County Board of Commissioners, recognize the sovereign right of our citizens to declare that their citizenship responsibilities be extended beyond our city and nation. We hereby join with other concerned people of the world in a declaration that we share in this world responsibility and that our citizens are in this sense citizens of the world. We pledge our efforts as world citizen to the establishment of permanent peace based on just world law and to the use of world resources in the service of man and not for his destruction. Be it further resolved that as a symbol of our obligation as world citizens, we request the Municipal Building Commission to proudly display the United Nations flag on suitable occasions at the main entrance to the City Hall and the main entrance to the new county building. Then it goes on and it shows the signatures of the mayor and the people on the council, and then the governor of the state of Minnesota, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the state of Minnesota, the President of the Minnesota Rabbinical Association, the Jewish community, members of Congress from Minnesota, Chairman of the Minnesota DFL Party, which is a separate political party, President of the League of Women's Voters of Minnesota, and it goes on and on and on. So Minnesota was the very first state, and a mayor of that city was the very first one that declared their citizens to be citizens of the world. So am I making this up? Have I been paranoia when I've been preaching about Bible prophecy and the United States of America is about to surrender its sovereignty and we're going to go into a world government? I don't think so. Mr. Harlan Cleveland, who also worked in the United States State Department during the Kennedy and the Johnson years, tried to bring Alger Hiss back into government. Remember, Alger Hiss was convicted and went to prison because he lied about being a card-carrying communist. This man, Harlan Cleveland, wrote a book called Agenda for the Planetary Bargain. In other words, he talked about world government. This was written for the United Nations organization. It was released in 1976 by the Senate Committee on Foreign Affairs. Here's what Harlan Cleveland called for. Number one, that they were to create a world food bank. And instead of the United States having supplies and surplus in our country in case of drought for our country, all of our surplus would go into a world food bank to be equally distributed to all countries of the world, any that needed it. Secondly, he called for the provision for international control of all sources and supplies of food. International control. Do you think that if they have control of the food supplies on a global basis, that it will matter whether you get food or whether anybody in India, Africa, if they equally distribute it the way the Marxist communists say so? No, people in this country will be no different than other people. So you may have some today, or you may not. He said, thirdly, he wanted to internationalize the commodity markets. Number four, establish international control over the wealth of the oceans and the deep sea beds. So what happened? The United Nations now has a treaty with the United States and other countries, and we have to get permission for use in the oceans. He said, a fifth point, to provide for international control of the weather at human command. How in the world could this man write that they would give into the hands of an international body control of the weather unless there are machinery that is in place today, discoveries by the Soviet Union and the United States, and they took it right out of Tesla's 900 patents in the United States Patent Office, in which they can control the weather to create weather war, drought, famines at will, whether they can make hurricanes and tornadoes at will. They can create earthquakes wherever they want along fault lines. Why would they say this? Unless it's a reality, and it is. Number six, he said he wanted to rewrite the rules of trade and investment. So what do we have today? NAFTA. We have the free trade agreement between Canada and the United States, so it effectively removes borders between those three countries. Then a seventh point, they wanted to create a world currency. Does this sound like Revelation 13, verse 16 to 18 to you? where no man will be able to buy or sell unless he has the mark. No one will be able to buy or sell unless the world currency is in your possession. Number 8, he said they wanted to create a world police force to keep the peace when it's threatened and to restore peace when it's broken. Does that sound like what is happening right now all over the world with the United Nations peacekeeping forces? This was in 1976. Number 9, provide special programs, remember these are his words, to teach the benefits of the new world order to each of the 6 categories of an American institutions: business, corporations, labor unions, nonprofit enterprises, which means churches, as well as others like your Lung Cancer Association, communications media, educational systems, and government agencies. Harlan Cleveland is a former ambassador to NATO. You must understand what the North American or North Atlantic Treaty Organization was. It was a division of the United Nations organization. So when he was a former ambassador to NATO, he was a former ambassador to the NATO, which was a division, one of 10 global divisions of the United Nations organization. Also, Harlan Cleveland was the Assistant Secretary of State. He was a Rhodes Scholar. What was written in the Senate Subcommittee on Un-American Activities way back in the 1960s, Rhodes Scholarships were given to individuals who were trained to subvert our way of life in this country. He was a longtime member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He was also a director of the Aspen Institute for Humanistic Studies, Humanism, and in which they also began to teach brainwashing and mind control. He also was a part of the program in International Affairs, which was a leftist communist think tank located in Princeton, New Jersey. And he makes clear what he's aiming at in his report. That is world government through the United Nations organization. And that's exactly what it says in Revelation 13, that there will come a rise of an end-time government. And that government will bear rule over every nation, language, and tongue. That means the totality of the world. There is a chart that is put out by the United Nations organization. I hold it in my hand. It says United Nations member contributions. The United States of America is the #1 contributor. They contribute right at 28% of the total global budget for the United Nations organization. Yet the United Nations organization is run by anti-Christian, anti-God personnel. They're working for the dismemberment of the United States and to take our national sovereignty and to make a global religion in which Christianity would be merged with pagan religions. And if you weren't a part of the world religion, you would be an outcast from that system. Here they are taking the tax money of a nation that was declared to be a Christian nation in a 9-0 decision of the Supreme Court on February 29th, leap year of 1892. Taking that money in order for us to actually create the beast system and sustain it for the purpose of eventually killing some of us, encamping others in their concentration camps. Others will get away and they'll be under the protection of God, but here our money is being used by our own government to enslave us. A congressman by the name of Sam Johnson put out a news release. This was on October 24th of 1995. Here's what he said. Johnson to oppose United Nations tax. Washington, D.C., Dateline. Representative Sam Johnson, Republican from Dallas, or representative, today began working on legislation to thwart a United Nations proposal to impose taxes on U.S. citizens. This tax would support the United Nations in addition to our own taxes, and they would not be lowered. I'll continue his quote. The United Nations has no authority over American citizens, and we aim to remind them of that fact, said Representative Sam Johnson. On Monday, a proposal was uncovered which revealed an effort by the United Nations to levy global tax equaling $1.5 trillion. Johnson will be working on this resolution affirming the sole constitutional authority of the United States Congress to lay and collect taxes. His last statement in this release was, "Our nation is currently questioning the competency and the necessity of the United Nations, and we're questioning how we can reduce our financial contribution to the organization." This is just one more example of how out of touch the United Nations organization is. End of quote. A U.S. Senator, Conrad Burns from Montana, gave a release to the newspapers on Monday, September 11th, 1995. Here's what he said. This was in response to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And it says, Byrne calls UNESCO intrusive, reacts to World Heritage Committee meeting on proposed New World mines. Washington, D.C. Montana Senator Conrad Burns today had the following reaction to the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. I'm not going to repeat all of this. All I'm going to do is summarize it. He said that UNESCO is a United Nations organization, and what it's for is actually to take over internal mining procedures in the United States of America. They would have the authority to determine which mines would produce, which ones would be closed down, how much land area around the mines should be reserved for habitats for birds and animals and so on. That means the United Nations organization would be on the soil of America telling us how to use our own land. There is a newspaper article that I want to quote quite extensively from. It says, "Will people give way to the ecosystems? Proposed actions would limit property rights and population." I've talked many times about how they created AIDS, man-made virus in the laboratory. They created other types of viruses and biological and chemical weapons, which was used in Saudi Arabia on 27 different countries. And now people are dying, up to 15,000. The latest count are sick. Most of them have died. 12,000 and 3,000 are in the process. And that does not even count the family members of these veterans that came back from there. This was a part of the lowering of the population and introducing man-made agents into society that our systems cannot reject. Notice what they said. The federal government considers people to be a biological resource that must be managed to protect the ecosystems. Did you know you're a biological resource? You're not a human being. That's why when they take over the world, they already have said that human beings will be work units. You'll be assigned a number, and they'll track you as a work unit, as a tax-paying unit, all the way through society, all of your purchases and everything. That is, if you're a part of the system. God Almighty says, don't be. It'll be wiser not to be. He went on to say, the government also wants to manage human reproduction to achieve its ecological goals. according to internal documents from the Environmental Protection Agency and the Federal Bureau of Land Management. So here are official documents from the government of the United States spilling the beans, how they're planning to control how many children you have, whether you have children or not, and what you're going to do with those children once they're born. Senator Conrad Burns, a representative from Montana, isn't happy with a proposal. This just confirms what we've already known, Burns Press Secretary Dick Wadhams said June 27th. The President administration is constantly trying to supersede local control over private property rights. Now remember, this newspaper article was written in 1995. It said the present administration, and when an administration is in office, they have a president who was elected and brought that administration into the government in Washington, D.C. Who is that current president that is trying to supersede local authority over private property rights? President Bill Clinton, who will be re-elected, and we'll have another 4 years of him. His superseding local control. How about in 1978? He was already in line and knew the possibility of becoming president of the United States. How about in 1984 when George Bush told him personally, if the American people got tired of the Republican Party and the way things were going under the Republicans, remember they ran up the national debt more than anybody in just Ronald Reagan's 8 years of all presidents combined in history? And he said in 1984, if you'll just sit still, you'll be president if they get tired of the Republicans. Who is president right now in 1992? I have another document in this 100 pages of notes for today's sermon that it does say that they would promote. This was written in 1976, and they said in 1992 they would put a far left candidate and they would put him into the presidency of the United States. A far left means communist, into the presidency of the United States. He went on throughout this article. He said the United States would be categorized and separated into ecosystems and ecoregions that would be monitored and controlled by federal agencies. They would actually break down the country and abolish state lines, and it would be broken down into ecosystems, and they would have certain areas that would be off limits to the American people, and it would be under the control of the United Nations organization, which is being denied by the federal government right now. But it's still true because you can get the facts and the documents to prove it, and I've got them in my hand right here. Even pictures where in the Great Smoky Mountains, the United Nations organization is listed right on the big billboard stating that this is a United Nations ecosystem. And there were so many complaints, the words disappeared, but not before the pictures were taken to prove it. This article says the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, favors a national ecosystem management plan that will not require congressional approval. Does that sound like straight tyranny and communism? No representation of the people? So, could the United States of America become a communist country without a shot being fired? Now, it won't. But I'm saying the legal groundwork is being laid. Oh yes, there's going to be people in this country that will rise up. They will not lay down and let international communism take over. Therefore, there will be blood in the streets. I'm not advocating it. I'm just telling you reality. I've talked to some of the people. They said they'll not allow it to come into this country. If we were independent and an independent nation state, then Washington, D.C. could never let the EPA become an organization without congressional approval. because we would be an independent nation and we would only delegate certain authority to Washington, D.C. But since all states' rights are gone, they feel they can do anything they want to. I'll just skip over the rest of that particular article. There's the cover page for the Global Biodiversity Assessment section. It's called Section 10. I'll kind of hold it up briefly just to let you see it does exist. In this particular Global Biodiversity section, I want to quote the first paragraph of the introduction. I want you to see there was an absolute blatant lie that was written into this. On September 30th, 1994, John Margolis reported in the Chicago Tribune that the Global Biodiversity Assessment did not exist. Quote, there is no such document, said a member of the staff of the United Nations Environmental Program. We have a biodiversity treaty and a secretariat, she said. The Global Biodiversity Assessment is a process just beginning in which scientists from all over the world will monitor the world's biological diversity. End of quote. I'm here to tell you this person lied outright. There was a biodiversity program in which they would take over regions of the world, declare it off limits to human population, and many of them are in the United States of America because I'm holding copies of that document right in my hand. In chapter 10.6, under legal measures for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, it says legislation is essential. Why is legislation essential? In order to confer jurisdiction and powers on public bodies and local communities for conservation. In other words, they are going to pass laws that makes it illegal. If you want to build a house somewhere and they say no way, you're not going to build it. To be exact, right now in Austin, Texas, a man bought a piece of land, had one tree on it. He started to build an office. They said, nope, you can't. It comes under the Wetlands Act of the United Nations. He said, what do you mean? There's not any water on it. There's only one tree. They looked up in the file and said, this property says that there may sometime in the future be a bird that may about to become extinct and land and build a nest there. So we can't let you disturb the habitat. So here he has a piece of property and he is told, oh, you own the property. He said, well, I'll build a building. They said, no, you'll go to jail if you do. He said, well, I don't own the property. They said, oh, yes, you do. Well, then I'm going to build a building. No, you can't. Well, who owns this property anyway, me or you? You see, this is what they're doing. Under communism, they control property. There is no such thing as property rights. That's what they want in the United States of America. Every piece of property, they must control it and give you only the thought in your mind that you own it. Down in 10.6.3, national legislation, it says, national legislation gives states police powers to control human activities. End of quote. You believe it doesn't exist? There it is. There is a government coming. They're going to own your property, my property, and if you want to go out and put a flower in the ground without personal written authorization from them, you can go to jail. They're going to own every piece of ground in the United States of America. They do everywhere else in the world when international communism takes over. In North Carolina, Mount Mitchell State Park, it was declared a United Nations Biosphere Reserve. And right there is the name United Nations right on the big billboard as you enter into the park. So when they say there is no such thing, they're liars. They have been promoting lies and deceit so they could work their world government since the beginning. That's the way Satan is. Satan is a liar from the beginning and a murderer from the beginning. So no wonder those who work under his control are deceitful. They'll do anything they can to keep the American public from understanding, yes, this world government is upon them and it's at the door, and they don't even know it. They sleep on. But unfortunately, a Major Peters in the Defense Department has said there is a class of people that are waking up that are very dangerous to the New World Order. In the Las Vegas Review-Journal of October 4th, 1995, the Associated Press released this, and the title is, "Words United Nations Removed from Park Sign." And the date line was Asheville, North Carolina. The words United Nations have been removed from a sign at Mount Mitchell State Park because suspicious tourists thought it meant the United Nations was taking over. And then they went on to say that no, they aren't taking over. All they were doing was just declaring it a biosphere, which is true, but they didn't tell the rest of it. That the government is passing laws to give police enforcement to control people. How about all of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park? It's now an international biosphere reserve. No one will be able, once they pass the laws, they won't be able to hunt. If you're caught on the grounds without authorization, it means prison time once they pass it into legislation. There's another publication put out. It's called the State of the World Forum, Toward a New Civilization. This was put out September 27th to October the 1st, 1995. See, the reason I'm doing this today is that I go back in history so many times that I give you historical documentation showing that yes, there is a groundwork that has been laid for world government. So today I'm bringing you within 1 year of the moment that I'm speaking to let you know it hasn't gone away, it's accelerated. And it's so close to being implemented that you and I had better make sure our relationship with our God is intact. And that we know who He is. And that we don't let down for a moment and let our own thought processes take over to exclude our spiritual relationship with our God. This particular publication was put out in San Francisco, California. And heading up the title on it and the address and the board of directors of those who put this out was Mikhail Gorbachev, chairman. Mikhail Gorbachev at one time headed up the KGB for international communism. He helped put people in prison. He helped to purge the party by murdering millions of people. And now he's sitting in the Presidio in the United States of America. And when he came into this country, he could have been elected president over George Bush. That's how popular he was with a dumbed-down America that doesn't even know that international communism and perestroika was nothing more than a front so that they could retool themselves and prepare for the final push by the year 2000. And so they've lulled the United States of America to sleep. You know whose other names happen to be listed on here as members of the board? George Shultz. He just happened a few years ago be a part of the government of the United States, Secretary of State. Ted Turner, who heads up one of the mightiest media conglomerates the world has ever seen, TNT, down in Atlanta, and all the other Turner networks. And the names could go on and on. I want to quote a part of the State of the World Forum. Quote, "There are good reasons for suggesting that the modern age has ended. Many things indicate that we're going through a transitional period. When it seems that something is on the way out, that means national sovereignty, your freedom and my freedom, something else is painfully being born. Yes, 160 million killed that resisted international communism. It is as if something were crumbling, that's Western Christian society, decaying and exhausting itself. while something else, still indistinct, were rising from the rubble. End of quote. That was one of those on the board of directors, Václav Havel. The mission of this State of the World Forum. The State of the World Forum will focus on the fundamental challenges and opportunities confronting humanity as we enter the next phase of human development. When you study their literature, you find out they believe that there is an individual called Lucifer who is overseeing the evolutionary progress of mankind. And now we're headed for the next phase of human evolution, in which there will be the age of Aquarius, a golden age, when there will be peace all over the world, and Lucifer will send his light to the world. He goes on. It is being held in the belief that at this momentous juncture in history, we are giving birth to the first global civilization. We must appreciate more deeply human unity and embrace more fully human diversity. Yes, we're different. We come from different backgrounds, different cultures, but we all have to unify and not step on each other's toes. He goes on the mission of that meeting. In this spirit, the intent of the forum is to articulate a clearer vision of new international priorities. Its task will be the generation of innovation that approaches to the challenges facing human society through a process which emphasizes global awareness, individual and communal empowerment, and a sense of hope. The historic gathering. That's his words. Satan always counterfeits. God is having a gathering himself, and he's going to bring people together, and they're going to be a light to this last generation before the year 2000 or during the last 3.5 years. How he will focus and how he will achieve it is his business. He's God. He can do anything he wants, but he will do it. And the Bible says that the entire world will be witnessed to. Everybody on earth is going to know, and they will at least have heard that this civilization they call the New World Order is run by the wrong people and for the wrong purposes. And there is coming a new age, yes, where Jesus Christ will rule, and where there will be benevolent, loving government, and where everybody on earth will have one set standard called the Ten Commandments, the everlasting covenant of God. And if individuals have never heard of the everlasting covenant, they'd better read the book of Hebrews again, chapter 13, verse 20 to 21. It's always existed, the same standard for every person that's ever drawn breath. He went on to say, inherent within the forum is the potential for the establishment of a global brain trust, which will continue even as we approach the year 2000. In this State of the World Forum, some of the participants I mentioned were Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of State, Ted Turner, and a man from bringing in the religious aspect from South Africa, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who received a Nobel Award for Peace one year, and yet when you check into his background, you'll find out he is a communist. He helped to overthrow the government to help bring in the communist government in South Africa right now. I just want to give one little statement on page 3 of the State of the World Forum. In new ways, our political leaders are challenged to provide the framework for stability and regulated human interactions. Now, let me ask you a question. If your actions are regulated, that means you're controlled. That means you have no freedom of speech, you have no freedom of religion, no freedom to own private property, because everything you do is regulated. That's what he just got through saying. They had a huge forum in the Presidio, one of our military bases that was closed, the only one large enough to protect us from an invasion from Asia and the Pacific Ocean. And they closed it and set it up so he could go there, Mikhail Gorbachev, and hold a world forum for leaders from all over the world to tell them all governments must start regulating their citizens. Tyranny, that's what it's called. One of the round table discussions, and they had many of them, but round table discussion number 14 was the new architecture of global security, in which they discussed a United Nations world police force that would be intact by the year 2000, so that no nation would be strong enough to stand up against the United Nations. And one way they decided at this forum that they can control people was through food. This is not new, however. All the way back in 1974, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, anybody that knew his background knew that he was a double agent. He was a communist. His communist code name was Boer in World War II. And yet he was the most powerful man when Richard Nixon stepped down from the presidency. He actually outlined a National Security Council program, and it was called NSSM 200. They outlined a covert plan to reduce the population of the world through birth control and war and famine. Created famines. And they would create wars to displace whole populations so that most of the people, the civilians, would die from starvation. What have they been doing in Africa for years now? Do we see the huge camps where the nomadic people have to come and try to survive? And if they try to airlift food into them, most of it is sold on the black market. To be exact, some of the food that was supposed to go to feed the Ethiopians, it was sold on the black market. And none of it got to the people that were being systematically starved to death by the Marxist regime that took over Ethiopia. I only want to mention one quote from another article entitled, "United Nations Plots One World Government." Despite the liberal distribution of the word human or humane throughout the United Nations, there is a specific report that talks about how they're going to reduce the population, they're going to sterilize people, and this type thing. They said human beings are not a higher priority. James Gustav Speth, S-P-E-T-H, head of this United Nations project, was the director for the Carter administration's Global 2000 report, which demanded, didn't ask, didn't request, but demanded that the world population be reduced to 2 billion from the current 5.5 billion by the year 2000. Now do you see why there's wars, why there are upset weather conditions, and why there is no harvesting of crops so that we can send it overseas anymore? Why was the greatest crop area for wheat and corn in the world devastated in the last few years? So they couldn't send it outside the borders to feed the rest of the world. So starvation will take place. Here is the Human Development Report of 1994, a picture of the cover page. This Human Development Report is exactly what they were talking about: the reduction of population, the starvation of people, and to create wars to cause people to be nomadic. And if you're nomadic, you can't be settled in one area, you can't turn the ground over, plant your seeds, wait for the food to grow. So that means you're dependent upon somebody else. And when you're dependent upon somebody else, you're going to starve to death in the third and fourth world countries. That's exactly what they have planned. Do you feel from everything that I've shown you and the cover pictures of the documents that we have a nice group of people running the world? I don't think so. I think they're under the sway of Satan the devil, and he is a real person, not a human being, but composed of spirit He can materialize and be seen by the human eye in the physical form, but he and his demons are in control of every government on earth, including the United States government. When Jesus Christ went up and he was tempted by Satan in Matthew 4 and Luke 4, Satan took him up and showed him all the nations of the world. Jesus didn't talk back to him. He said, yes, I know you have authority to give me kingship over the world if I'll only bow down and worship you. Anyone that will bow to Satan, he will see to it they have power. He'll see to it they'll succeed in this life, but not in the future. It'll require wholesale repentance. As a direct result of all these documents that I've shown you that are 1994, 1995, and if I get time, I'll get to the ones in 1996. Before these were all put down in their final plans, they began to pass laws in the United States to prepare for the day when they would have tyranny. They would have martial law and implement every one of these. I'll only mention a few of these. Executive Order number 10,995 gives the government the right to seize all communications in America. Every radio station, television station, every ham radio, all types of communications. 10,997, this is executive orders. Congress didn't vote on it. The Senate didn't bring it up. No, one man called the President of the United States wrote it. And then 30 days later it became law. They said under 10,997 they could seize all electric power, all fuels, and it even delineates gasoline, petroleum, and minerals, both public and private. So when the time comes, do you think we're going to have gas? No, we're not. Do you think we're going to be immobilized except for our feet and a bicycle? Yes, we are. We're not even going to be able to go from one place to another in an automobile. We'll have ration gasoline. And it'll be based upon the importance of your or my job. Number 10,998 says they would have the right to seize all food supplies and resources, public and private, all farms and all farm equipment. If they own it all, that means we don't have any. If they plan on having tyranny, and if they plan on blotting out 60% of the world's population, when this begins to happen and there is no food available, do you think they're going to be so loving and kind they're going to invite you into the White House to have dinner? I don't think so. I think they're going to gleefully watch us starve to death on the streets because they have to reduce the world's population, and because it is Lucifer or Satan the devil, his religious belief that is being fostered upon the world, and he has told the world that we're nothing but animals, and it's survival of the fittest. And if you and I are not a part of the fittest, we don't survive, and that we just die out. We'll turn back into something else. It's called pantheism. You don't really die, you just become a part of creation somewhere else. You're dust somewhere, or plant food, or become cat food, who knows what. But you and I, we don't really die. We're just recycled. In number 10,999, they said that they would be able to seize all means of transportation. And the key word is all, including personal cars, trucks, or vehicles of any kind, and a total takeover of all highways, seaports, and waterways. That limits traveling ability, doesn't it? You know, if the great God of the universe, and He is great, He created all things, but if that great God were to put in the pages of the Bible one little set of scriptures that said, I'm going to protect a group of people that are called by my name because they love me, they're daring to step out when the rest of the world will compromise, I'm going to see to it those people don't have to go through all of this. Oh yeah, they'll start out in the persecution, then they'll fly into a place that I'm going to prepare for them. You know, if they're not there in advance, It may be very difficult to get there when these laws come into effect. If there is not going to be a ship, and if you don't have the proper papers to go into a car and ride on the highways, how are you going to get there? What if you don't have a passport to get on a ship to go down a river somewhere? You're not going to get there except on foot through the backwoods. And hopefully the black helicopters won't spot you. Oh yes, there's going to be some times coming that you and I haven't even begun to think about yet. We don't like to put them in our mind. We like to block them out and to think they're not going to happen to us. Yes, they are. They happen in Vietnam. They happen in Laos. They happen in Cambodia. They've happened in every other country in the world. South Africa, they didn't think it would come there either, but it's reality right now. They have a communist regime there, and they're now purging people, and they're prosecuting the former white rulers of that country. Oh yes, America, it's coming. Number 11,000 executive order says they would be able to seize all American people for workforces under federal supervision. Ready to change jobs? They'll provide you one. Including, in this executive order, splitting up of families if the government says so. Husband, you go to Minnesota to work in the mines. Wife, you go down to this place and you work in the kitchens for somebody else. Your children, well, they'll go to the slave labor camp in Nevada. So they will split up families just like they did under the Nazi regime, National Socialism during World War II. Number 11,001 said they'll seize all health, education, welfare facilities, both public and private. Want to have your children in a private educational institution to avoid the New World Order propaganda? Eventually, there won't be any private. It'll only be in your own home, homeschooling, eventually. 11,002 says that they will have the power, and this will empower the Postmaster General to register every man, woman, and child in the United States. And if you're not registered, guess what? You will be considered a resistor. They're building concentration camps. Just read the November-December issue of 1996 of the Newswatch magazine when it's out. Number 11,003 says they will seize all airports and all aircrafts. So there goes anyone jumping in their aircraft and flying to wherever God says this place will be, where His church in the wilderness. 11,004 says they will seize all housing. None of us will have a house anymore if we're under the jurisdiction of this beast system. And financial authorities. Now if God severs out of the nation or out of all communities of the world a place where He's going to place His name and where He will protect His people, then we may have a house to live in. Or He may be, He can do anything He wants. He can put up a big bubble over us and the rest of the world can't see us. We don't know how He's going to do it. We'll wait around and He'll show us. But God's in charge, and if your heart is right with Him and you understand what this everlasting covenant is, then God will see to it that you'll be in the right place at the right time if you have belief. 11,005 of these executive orders says that they can seize all railroads, inland waterways, all storage facilities, both public and private. And then 11,000, number 51, provides for the Office of Emergency Planning, which is now FEMA, to handle all operations. But is there something else the United States government is doing to prepare us for world government? Is there a very sinister program in which they're going to reduce the population? Under the Chemical Biological Warfare Section 50 USCS, that's the U.S. Codes, number 1520. Here's what it says under number 1520, Section A, subsection 1. The Secretary of Defense, he's the one ultimately in charge, will involve the use of human subjects for the testing of chemical and biological agents. I lie not. I'm holding it in my hand. The federal government of the United States has given permission to the Secretary of Defense to develop a chemical, biological warfare materials in which he uses human guinea pigs. Now do you understand why AIDS came into being? It was in the 1970 appropriations for the Defense Department. A $10 million appropriation just so they could start developing something that would affect the human body, and our autoimmune system could not operate against it. It became known as AIDS. And then, of course, we went on from there into the war in the Middle East. Under section part 6, employment of personnel in this particular document, section 601, it says, the National Defense Executive Reserve, and it talks about in the event these things need to be implemented, these biological chemical agents, then it would be implemented by the Department of Defense. And they can be used on private citizens of the United States. And it goes on and down, it even says in subsection F, the director of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, shall coordinate the program and all of its activities. And it talks about establishing recruitment for people to administer the program, training of them, and the activation of the program. This is reality in our country. Do you realize the United Nations had a meeting in China just in 1995? I want to read to you the front page. This was by Catherine Bertini, Executive Director of the United Nations World Food Program. This was the caption of their brochure in Beijing, China, the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women, September of 1995. Here is the heading on this brochure: Food is power. We use it to change behavior. Some may call that bribery. We do not apologize. Are they going to use food to control the world? Yes, they are. It's in their plan. They planned it in 1995. They finalized it. Even in Reader's Digest, which for years was a conservative magazine or booklet monthly, they had a big caption in there: the United Nations is out of control. And a man went to the United Nations organization and began to read all of their materials. And he came to the conclusion that the United Nations organization is a giant world bureaucracy that's going to create nothing but horror, and that it should be abolished, and that we should get out of the United Nations and get it off the shores of America. And here is just one of the captions in that magazine. And he discovered this going through all the documents of the United Nations organization. And remember, these documents were approved by the Secretariat of the United Nations. United Nations food aid for Somali refugees was sold on the black market, while 50 people a day died at Dolo refugee camp in southern Ethiopia. So all this food that was the American people brought together, and it was shipped over in the big huge aircraft, they used it to raise funds for their operations. It was sold on the black market, and none of it reached the people that it was intended for. There was a newspaper article in the Los Angeles Times which referred to future trends. There was a man by the name of Lester Brown that was interviewed. I'll quote, "The world's ability to match its population growth with more bountiful grain harvest has finally come to an end, ushering in a new age of scarcity in which food prices could soar to record levels while food supplies fall at record lows. Who is this man that was interviewed and said that? And this went out all across America in the newspapers and on the national media, television, and so on. He happened to be the head of World Watch Institute, which has been cited in the past as a Communist Front organization. Now, this particular man, Lester Brown, is a one world promoter. And of course, this is the promotion of lies. There was deliberate weather war made to destroy crops in the Midwest of the United States. And then there are government programs which farmers have told me about, where the government, when you enter into it, the government pays you and they can tell you what crops to grow, which ones not to grow, and when you cannot grow crops at all. You don't control your own land. So how is this famine going to come? It's not going to be because the world cannot produce the food. We can produce enough food in Kansas to supply 60% of the world alone. And that's a fact. And yet we're told that we're not going to have the food. It's because those in charge of this United Nations world government that's coming is going to use food against the American people, not only America, but the world. And they're going to use it to reduce the population, and the ones that are left, if you cooperate, you will get food. If you do not cooperate, they'll starve you, or they'll take you to the concentration camps where they'll be more merciful. Maybe there'll be a gas chamber, or even better than that, a guillotine. You know the old song that says, it only hurts a little while. I've got a song for every occasion. There's another newspaper article from the Grand Forks Herald. This was Sunday, November 26, 1995. Food, it will cost you more to eat. And it goes on and talks about the fresh vegetables and fruits are being destroyed because of the weather conditions. And beef is now, because of the weather conditions, you can't raise beef anymore. It costs you more to raise it than you can sell it for, so people are trying to eat them up or get rid of them. That means there'll be a deliberate scarcity in this country, and this country feeds the world, basically. He says that a boom in United States food exports will cause some of the increase. That means the rise in prices, especially for fruits and vegetables. So while tight grain supplies caused by a strong export market and poor harvests, which raise the cost of livestock feed. So he says that's why the price will go up. But you see, over on the side in this article was a little box, and it says, is NAFTA working? And this man tells the truth as to what's going on, because they brought about NAFTA for the purpose of destroying the economy of the United States and to redistribute the wealth of the world away from America. He said, and I'm going to quote this, a small factory in Brainerd, Minnesota laid off 70 of its 100 employees and quit making video cassette parts because of the competition from Mexican imports. Across the border in Fargo, North Dakota, Palliser Furniture closed a chair factory, laid off 300 employees, and headed north to Winnipeg, Canada. Have the free trade agreements with Mexico and Canada backfired on workers in the upper Midwest? It's backfired on the workers, but it's working to perfection for those that brought it to pass. Oh yes, they know exactly what they're doing. You know, when a group of individuals called the Illuminati controls certain of the world's supplies, they're going to be able to call the shots every single time. There is a House of Windsor in which they're a part, some of their family members of the Illuminati. When you look and see how they control a great deal of the oil, gas, and coal industry, the food industry, the minerals and the metal industry of the world, one family. can have the say-so as to whether you get sugar or not, as to whether you're going to be able to have any type of grains or not, because they control Archer Daniels Midland, which controls 95% of the import-exports of the United States inside and outside of this country for grains. And so when they control everything, you and I are at their mercy. This is reality. The Bible says so in Revelation 13. There's going to come a global government. It's not going to have mercy upon anyone. Anyone who objects to this is going to be eliminated. And our only hope can be in the one and only Savior of this world, Jesus Christ. There can be no sideline activities for us. Our need is to make sure where our allegiance is involved right now. I know most people listening to this tape live in this audience, they've counted the cost. They know what's coming. Otherwise, you couldn't be in this church. We don't talk about nice little sewing parties for all the women next week. We talk about reality. We talk about life and death. Those who are empowered by Satan, and only God can allow Satan to do anything. Read Job 1 and Job 2. Without the authority of God Almighty saying you can do these things, he couldn't. But you see, Satan doesn't even know that he's beating his head against a brick wall. He's the loser, because God is the God of the living, not the dead. He's the God of the resurrection. He knows every hair of our head, and if he puts his Spirit in us, we're going to be changed at that last trump. We'll meet him in the air, and then we'll receive our reward. And the rest of humanity will take their place, which I'll not discuss today. Do you realize that the Department of Army and the Air Force have actually come into agreements with foreign communist countries to bring them into the United States of America to train their personnel? Alabama has a partner. That's what they call them, state partners. The state is Alabama. The partner is Romania, communist. Arizona is the state. The partner is Kazakhstan, which is one of those little provinces that you can't spell because they have one vowel and all the rest are consonants. Then California has the Ukraine, Colorado, Slovenia, Illinois, Poland, Indiana, Slovakia, Maryland, Estonia. Michigan's partner is Latvia. Ohio is Hungary, Pennsylvania, Lithuania, South Carolina, Albania, Tennessee, Bulgaria, Texas, the Czech Republic, and it goes on and on and on. And this copy came right off the Department of the Army and the Air Force with their own letterhead. So they are coming into the United States. And here's what this letter said. It is linking the National Guard of the United States with the Russian military. Now, this was put out before the dissolution of the USSR. So all the military at that time was Russian military. And then it goes on and tells about other states that are now going into agreements with other countries. Some of those are Alaska, Arkansas, and so on. And so eventually all 48 states in this country, 50 really, will have a partner in which they eventually will train them for the peacekeeping forces of the world. There are things that are happening now on an accelerated rate. It's called weather conditioning. There are hurricanes that now they've called them hurricane alerts because they're becoming more powerful than ever before. They have found that when extremely low frequency magnetic waves are found in a certain area, the hurricanes are more powerful than ever. There's always been hurricanes, tornadoes, that reduces the air pressure and so on. But when these items are found with extremely low frequency magnetic waves, that means they were humanly created. And that's happening more than ever before. To be exact, a new research installation that is now beaming very powerful radio energy into the United States and really around the world. And it's going to be used for various reasons. And it's found up in Alaska. It's called HARP. This is a research station found at Gaconia, Alaska. I have a picture of it. All the antennas that are sticking up in the air. The Department of the Air Force is the one that's in charge of the HARP operation. And I'll just quote one part of this director, the Office of Public Affairs for this HARP operation. He says, while there are some superficial similarities between our research and Eastland's theories. Think about some of the sermons I've given in the past in some of our magazines. Remember Tesla, back around the turn of the century, created 900 patents on electricity and so on. And then the Arco Oil Company, and one of their doctors that worked for them, a Dr. Eastland, patented certain things. It told how they could use it for weather modification and so on. He actually states in a public release that HARP in reality can do many of the things that the Eastland patents could do. And so what are they going to use these for? Earthquake activity. They're going to use them for weather war against anyone that will not remain in the New World Order. They're going to use it for mind control. It's an absolute fact. When they had a blackout in New York City many, many years ago, people went along their merry way. But then the next time they had a big blackout, they emitted extremely low frequency magnetic waves around 6.67. And people became frantic. They began to loot, riot. There were killings all over the place. And so they know how to manipulate the mind of man through extremely low frequency magnetic waves. This is a very dangerous thing they're doing, because this HARP emissions can destroy communications all over the world. Airlines that are flying close to it in Alaska, they can lose all their communications. They can actually lose power and crash. They can actually, through the HARP program, they can generate an electrical outpouring of extremely low frequency magnetic waves in a single line. It would be nearly like beam warfare. They can actually knock down out of the sky any type of aircraft they want, and there is nothing to prove how it was done. Oh yes, this is going to be a very dangerous thing to the United States and the rest of the world, because it's going to be in the hands of those individuals who are empowered by Satan and his demons, and they hate human beings. There's so much I'd like to say today, but I realize there is something called the back end, and it can only sit so long until you begin to wiggle and you begin to lose circulation. I realize those things, so I'm going to start bringing this to a close. But one of the things that they did say that the uses of this HARP mechanism would be was that it could actually, these are scientists that have asked the government not to consider going along or going ahead with this HARP program. They said that the earth is run by magnetism, and when they generate a certain amount of extremely low frequency magnetic waves, and they go up into the ionosphere with these things, and they create bubbles, and it affects the magnetism. It's in Alaska, but it can affect the magnetism in Australia. Then the earth can begin to wobble just a little bit out of its orbit. Turn to Isaiah chapter 24 if you have your Bible with you. Isaiah 24, verse 18 to 20. Mankind is on the verge of destroying himself if Jesus Christ does not return. I'll just read the last part of verse 18, the last phrase. For the windows from on high are open, and the foundations of the earth shake. The earth is utterly broken down. The earth is clean dissolved. The earth is moved exceedingly. What is it talking about here? Magnetism that holds the earth in its proper orbit. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and shall be removed like a cottage, and the transgression thereof shall be heavy upon the earth. You see, there's transgression of God's spiritual laws, but there's also transgression of God's physical laws. And when the physical laws are transgressed, it affects the physical things around us. And when the magnetism of planet Earth is affected, then everything that is stable about planet Earth in its orbit going around the sun, and even the moon going around the earth, all of a sudden can be affected. My closing scriptures today, and I want to admonish anyone that ever hears this by radio, possibly television, on a cassette tape or video. This is bad news I've been talking about today, but I want you to know the good news. And only you as an individual, I don't care who you are, where you are, only you can do something about it. You and I, no matter what, cannot stop this progression of world government. Physically and humanly, we can't do it. Therefore, it's up to you and me in our personal and private life to do something. It's found in Hebrews 13, verse 20 to 21. Now the God of peace that brought again from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, through the blood of the everlasting covenant. Jesus Christ was God in the Old Testament. He came in a human form and died to forgive us for breaking His everlasting covenant. The very same covenant given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And the same one that it says in Hosea 6, 6 and 7 that Israel broke. And so it is that Jesus Christ came and died to forgive us for violating His one and only covenant. In verse 21 it says, if we accept that shed blood to forgive us, then we can go forward. Make you perfect in every good work to do His will, working in you that which is well-pleasing in His sight through Jesus Christ. So Jesus Christ, by coming into our minds, can alter our course in this life. He can change us from a physical mindset to a spiritual mindset. That is the only way that you and I are ever going to be able to be translated from the kingdom of Satan into the kingdom of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. But if you've never heard of what the everlasting covenant is, that means as a private citizen you have the opportunity. It doesn't matter what the local church where you may attend says. It doesn't matter. They can deny to the cows come home that Jesus Christ died for the everlasting covenant. Just ask the minister if he knows what the everlasting covenant is, or if it's even mentioned in the Bible, and then you be the one to decide whether you're being told the truth. How can you repent of something if you don't even know what it is? Now, why am I saying that somebody has got to repent? The only way you can reverse the tide of world government run by Satan and his demons is going to be if there is wholesale repentance from breaking the everlasting covenant. Isaiah 24, verse 1 to 5. Behold, the Lord makes the earth empty. He makes it waste, turns it upside down, and scatters abroad the inhabitants thereof. And it shall be as with a people, so with a priest. And that should say prince, the government rulers as well as the average citizen. As with a servant, so with a master. So this verse tells us something is going to happen to every person on earth regardless of your status in life. Verse 3, the land shall be utterly emptied, utterly spoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. The earth mourns and fades away. The world languishes and fades away. The haughty people of the earth do languish. Notice, the earth also is defiled, and that Hebrew word means polluted, under the inhabitants thereof. Why in the world is the world going to hell in a handbasket and doesn't even know what's happening to it? Because they have transgressed the laws. And that Hebrew word is God's laws, given at Mount Sinai. He's changed the ordinance. We have our supply of holy days throughout the year, but they are pagan holidays. We have rejected God's ways in Leviticus 23. And it says, we have broken the everlasting covenant. That's why this world is being allowed to go into the system. It is breaking everything that is dear to God. He said in Deuteronomy 28:15, if you won't obey my commandments, my statutes, my judgments, in summary, the everlasting covenant, then all these curses will come. The only way you and I will be able to avoid all these curses is by living dramatically in our lives the everlasting covenant. I encourage you to do so.